And the reason they're doing this is that these prices will eliminate a lot of cruising. Here's the ordinance language to implement this is very simple. The city council gives up on the idea that it knows the right price. They say we know the right occupancy. They assign the city staff the responsibility to set the prices to achieve that occupancy, and they return the money. That most city legislation is very complicated. This is very simple. It's easy to explain. So these performance-based prices, they adjust over time to get about 85% occupancy, and then everybody can see it's convenient. So these are performance-based prices. You want to have it perform well. Here is the results of studies on 4 continents over the past 82 years of how much of the traffic in the downtowns is hunting for a curb parking space. That on average, it was about 30% of the vehicles on the street that they could identify were hunting for curb parking. It took about 8 minutes to find the space. Here's a interesting study done in Chicago in the 1930s showing graphically the paths taken by vehicles as they hunted for parking. Some cars aimed for one block only, others were more inventive and they were trying to open to new options, and this creates an awful lot of traffic. The reason they do it, and I'm sure it's happening in Paris, is because the curb parking is often so cheap. I think there's a Paris paradox. You have some of the most valuable land on earth, but as I look at your parking meters, if you're a resident, you can pay €2.50 for a week of free parking. I don't think there's a better bargain on earth. I don't think you can get a more expensive piece of land for so little any place on earth unless you're a driver in Paris. And that probably means there are a lot of people driving around hunting for parking. Here's the parking meter that I photographed in Paris. The sidewalks are so narrow, you had to walk single file. All the spaces were occupied. And people driving around, as soon as they see a space, they'll often make a U-turn in the middle of the street trying to get to the other side. Here's some grainy footage of this that I took. And fortunately, I interviewed the driver after she got out of her car, and she said that she does whatever it takes to find a curb parking space in Paris. The goal, as I'm suggesting, is that the block should look like the ones on the left, with on the right, with 1 or 2 vacant spaces all the time. Otherwise, if you don't have the price too low, you'll find cars cruising all around. Here's an example of how this works on the UCLA campus with these multi-space parking meters. There's no price marked on the machine. You don't know what the price is until you press a button. And this tells you the price at that hour. Say, here's the first. They don't even tell you the price per hour. They just say, well, if you want to park for 20 minutes, it's $1. So it turns out it's $3 for the first hour and $4 for the second hour. I just took some pictures for an hour. I won't show them all to you, but it just shows what happens. Some cars come in, other cars move out, but every time you come looking for a parking space, there's one. You don't have to drive around at all. And here's the results of it. Most of the time, there was 1 vacant space. Sometimes there was none. Sometimes there were 2. But I think that's the way the parking ought to perform. And I think if they did that in Paris or London or any other city, this performance pattern would eliminate a lot of unwanted vehicle travel. And you don't have to take pictures now. There are occupancy sensors that you can place on the street that measure the change in the Earth's magnetic field with their 2 tons of metal above it, and they report to the city hall whether the space is occupied or not. Here's what they look like on the street. And here's a setup of these 200 of them on Hollywood Boulevard in Los Angeles, showing that when they actually began measuring it, it turns out a lot of the spaces that are occupied are not paid for. Everybody has done that, haven't you? And they raised the price looking for more money, and it just it had very little effect. Look, the occupancy rate is too low already. They shouldn't have been raising the price of parking. They should have just been ticketing for it. Here's another block where the occupancy was very high, but when they raised the price, it didn't create enough vacancies. The price is too low even at $2 an hour. Well, I'd like to conclude. Oh, yes, I was saying, what could you do with if you did this in Paris? I just took some photographs yesterday. Well, here's a nice block in front of my hotel. They'd taken a curb parking space and made it into a cafe, tables. I think that might be a better place. They would yield more revenue for the city. It would employ more people. It would pay more taxes. It would be, if that only would earn €2.50 a week as parking, maybe it's doing better for this. I mean, you even use the sidewalks for fueling stations. Maybe it would be better to take some of the curb spaces and parking spaces and turn them into human uses. Here's an example of you've taken some parking spaces and made it into shared space for bicycles. I'm sure that Francois Auchet would love that. That you're taking it from some people who would have used it for 3 or 4 cars. It would serve 3 or 4 people, and now it's a shared space that's available to everybody. And here is what Elizabeth Sullivan will be talking about. They shared, they dedicate curb parking spaces to shared vehicles so that everybody could use these spaces. And so we have, we have a choice. Do we want this? That's in Los Angeles. Let me just finish with a view of what I think we could do. Here's Silicon Valley. Suppose we allowed developers to build housing on these parking lots. I took this from the University of London. You really can't do that. So I took a pedestrian-looking apartment building in Los Angeles. We could make it look like Paris. We could take these awful parking lots, and if the city only allowed developers to build on them, it would save a lot of problems. What would we do with all the cars? Well, here's a sculpture in France that suggests a good solution. What about all the parking garages? Well, here's a solution in Holland that I like. But I think that no matter what we do, we'll always have this problem unless General Motors succeeds with this technology that it's working on. But I don't think I can conclude better than to say what Abraham Lincoln said, as our cases do, so we must think anew and act anew. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Merci Donald Shoup pour cette présentation. Donc, je vous avais dit qu'on aurait des angles d'attaque là où, en l'occurrence, on aborde la mobilité en Californie à travers et d'abord le stationnement, mais justement, on va inviter Donald à... Je vais d'abord inviter les membres de la commission qui ont abandonné le poste à revenir. Donc, je remercie aussi Donald de nous renvoyer vers le paradoxe parisien. Mais le mari de la dame que vous avez présenté va le résoudre très vite.